All right. Hello and welcome back, everyone. We're going to pick up today where we left off last time with our discussion of World War II. Specifically, last time we left off with the year 1940. We talked about German aggression in Europe. We talked about Hitler's expansion into both Eastern Europe and Western Europe. We talked about the fall of France and the division of France into Nazi-occupied France and the Vichy government that was established. We also talked about the expansion into Eastern Europe, countries such as modern-day Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia. And we talked about how by 1940, if we're looking at the map of who's in the war, who's fighting who, so by 1940, Germany, as you remember, had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. So Germany and the Soviet Union had essentially agreed to split up Eastern Europe between themselves, under the agreement that they would not attack each other, would not press each other. So basically, at this time, it's the Axis powers, who currently consist of Germany and Italy, versus the Allied powers, who at this time was just the United Kingdom. France had fallen, so the United Kingdom is left alone to face Nazi Germany and the Axis powers. That's not to say that the United Kingdom wasn't receiving help. Of course they were, especially from the United States. Have you ever heard of the Lend-Lease Act? The United States was lending the United Kingdom military supplies, medical supplies, food supplies. The United States was sending all of this to the United Kingdom ever since the beginning of the war. Of course, other neutral nations such as Spain was supporting Germany through, even though they were technically neutral, were supporting Germany through foodstuffs as well as raw material and natural resources. So this is technically happening on both sides. But by 1940, Germany has taken over most of what it set out to take over in terms of its European expansion. And all that's left is the United Kingdom. Now, as I said before, 1941, all of this is going to change. It's going to change very radically because of the two events that I mentioned last time, two major events of 1941. The first that's going to happen is Operation Barbarossa, and the second that is going to happen is the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's the Japanese surprise attack against the American naval base in Hawaii on Pearl Harbor. So this is going to change the who's on what side, basically. So let's take a look. Okay. We're going to come back to Operation Barbarossa and to Pearl Harbor, but I want to kind of divide up both sides. That way we understand who's fighting who, and that way we understand some of the terminology that's being used. So after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, by the end of 1941, this is what our map looks like in terms of the Allies versus the Axis. So, well, we'll see here in a second. So what happens? Okay, with Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany will declare war on the Soviet Union, modern-day Russia. Nazi Germany will declare war on the Soviet Union. As a result, the Soviet Union will seek out a natural ally in the UK. So, the Soviet Union will join the Allied powers. All right? Japan, who up until this point has had communication with Nazi Germany, their Prime Minister Tojo will, the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, will have good relations with Nazi Germany. They'll make some agreements. By 1941, the Japanese will officially align themselves with Nazi Germany. And as you well know, Japan will also carry out a surprise attack on the United States. So the United States will be brought into the war. And of course, after Japan attacks the United States, Germany a few days later, so Japan attacks the United States December 7th is Pearl Harbor. I think it's by December 10th, maybe 10th, 11th. A couple of days later, not more than a week later, Hitler also declares war on the United States. So the United States will also join the side of the Allies. All right, so we basically, if we want to do like a very simplistic version, we could just put three on each side. Of course, there are other colonies which are involved. Several major British commonwealths, such as Canada, India, Australia, will also be involved in the fight. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll stick with the major powers. Okay. So on the one hand, you have the Allies. The Allies consist of, excuse me, the Allies consist of the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States. All right. So we have the Allies, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States. On the other side, we have the Axis powers. The Axis powers. Germany, Japan, Italy. The Axis powers. Germany, Japan, Italy. Again, by 1941, France has fallen. So France, although there will be French resistance, there'll also be Italian resistance and German resistance. But France, what it once was, is no longer an ally. So two sides to World War II, the Allies and the Axis. By 1941, this is what these two sides look like. Right? We can also talk about and focus on the leadership of World War II, the leadership of the Allies and the Axis. Again, I believe I said this last time, but there's a ton of research, there's a ton of literature out there about these particular rulers. Um, I took an entire class in graduate school on just the Allied rulers, specifically um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, about the correspondences between these three men and how these three men planned out the end of the war. So there's a lot of research out there. But okay, so we have the Allies and we have the Axis. So on the Allies, and this is a very unlikely trio. The Soviet Union allied itself with Great Britain really out of necessity. Not that they had a whole lot in common. It's not that they, politically speaking, it's not that the Soviet Union was very similar to the UK. If you remember correctly, Joseph Stalin was the leader. This is Joseph Stalin here. Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. The Soviet Union, if you go back and listen to the World War I lecture, uh, Russia has to withdraw from the First World War because of the Russian Revolution. Sometimes it's called the Bolshevik Revolution, in which the Russian monarchy was replaced with a new form of government, the Russian Communist Party. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, took over and instituted communism in Russia, changing it from Russia to the Soviet Union or the USSR. So um, the Soviet Union is a communist country, yes, but Stalin is going to change the government. Again, there's some good resources out there to explain how and why this happened, but Stalin is going to change the Soviet government from more of a oligarchy type situation where you have groups of people at the top who are collectively making a decision. Stalin is going to move more towards a totalitarian type government with Stalin as the supreme leader. So kind of um, almost like if you think of medieval times, almost like a monarchy where power is centered in the hands of one person. But instead of a king, we have a totalitarian leader. So Stalin is essentially a dictator. He's consolidated power. He's the one calling the shots. He's the one making the decisions. So Stalin is the leader of the Soviet Union, 1941. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, probably one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. He was the president who was active at the time during the American Great Depression. He's the president who got the United States out of the Great Depression with his New Deal. There's a whole lot of literature that's been written on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he's very important in terms of U.S. history and, of course, in terms of world history. But this will be Franklin Delano Roosevelt's fourth term. He's the only U.S. president to serve more than 2 terms. And he will also die in office. He will die and be replaced by Dwight Eisenhower, who was a general at the time, one of the head generals leading up the campaign in Europe. So, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and this fine English gentleman here is Winston Churchill. Churchill, another very popular British prime minister. Churchill will come to power towards the beginning of the war. I want to say he became prime minister of the UK, 1940, I believe. As you could tell by now, I'm not great with dates, so double check me on that date. Churchill will become prime minister. Churchill fought in the First World War. Churchill was very popular at the time, made his way up through Parliament, and would become prime minister in 1940. It's Churchill who will be standing alone against Hitler in 1940, who will be fighting this war of attrition with Germany, and who will lead the British people through that, which is another reason for his popularity. Okay, so the Allied powers: Joseph Stalin, FDR, Churchill. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill. Okay, so Axis powers. Axis powers. So first of all, we have the power of Japan, the Empire of Japan. Japan's history in the 20th century is very complicated. So Japan, this is a source of confusion for a lot of my students, and it's confusing for me as well because it's complicated. So both the UK and Japan are similar in the fact that they still have a monarchy. They still have kings and queens. In fact, the UK, even to today, you still have the royal family, right? In the UK, the royal family doesn't really have any political power, okay? In Japan at the time, you have a similar, this is kind of debatable, okay, but you have a similar situation. So this is General Prime Minister. He was General and Prime Minister. Prime Minister Tojo Hirohito. No, Hirohito is the Emperor. Tojo is the Prime Minister. Hinaki Tojo. I think his first name is Hinaki. So you have a parliamentary system, a system of government that resembles what you see in the UK. With democratically elected officials. Japan, I said Japanese history is interesting because at the beginning of the 20th century, you have this very strong democratic movement in Japan. The early 20th century, the strong democratic movement where you have democratically elected officials. Japan is kind of embracing the parliamentary system that it's inherited from the West, from places like the UK. But towards the mid-1920s, towards the 1930s, Japan becomes increasingly nationalistic and increasingly militaristic, and as a result, you get the emergence of these strong men, these strong leaders. So, so you have on the one hand, you have the Japanese emperor. In Japan, they call them emperors, not kings. You have the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, who's the Emperor of Japan at the time of World War II. But he's very limited in his political power. So that's why when we talk about the political representation of Japan, the political leadership of Japan, most of it's focused on this gentleman here, Prime Minister Tojo. Of course, the leader of Nazi Germany at the time, Adolf Hitler. Again, there's a lot of stuff out there about how Hitler came to power, about why Hitler was able to come to power. Um, Germany, before Hitler in the 1930s, 1920s, also there was a strong democratic movement in Germany. Hitler, as many people don't know, was democratically elected. He was voted upon by the people. The German people really liked Hitler. He had this very strong personality. He had all these great solutions to get Germany out of debt. Germany at the time was facing a massive, massive economic depression, much in the same way that the United States was having an economic depression. And also, much in the same way that FDR will propose his New Deal in order to get the United States out of the depression, Hitler will also make these grand proposals to get Germany out of its depression. And like FDR, Hitler was very successful with this. So it's easy to forget that, a lot of the German people at the time liked Hitler. He was, by their accounts, by their standards, he was a good ruler. He got Germany out of this massive economic slump. He revamped the German economy. People were going back to work. People were employed, they were making money, and he rearmed Germany. He got Germany's pride back, so to speak. So again, very popular. A lot of stuff out there about how the Nazis the Nazi Party came to power. I addressed this a little bit of this in my Nazi ideology video. And the last member of the Axis powers, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini came to power, was head of the Italian fascist movement in Italy, came to power in the 1930s, and from the get-go kind of promoted himself as this powerful figure, consolidated power within the Italian government, and ruled Italy with this like iron fist. But again, to begin with, supported by the general people, because it was believed that Mussolini would be able to get Italy out of their situation. Okay, so once more, the Allied powers, the leaders of the Allied powers, Joseph Stalin, FDR, Winston Churchill, the leaders of the Axis powers, Prime Minister Tojo, Hitler, Mussolini. All right, so let's get back to those two major events. Operation Barbarossa and the attack on Pearl Harbor. All right. Actually, let me pull up this map. So Germany has expanded into Eastern Europe, and Hitler has signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. They've agreed to basically split up Eastern Europe. But so when I say that Germany's signed a non-aggression pact, I don't necessarily mean they're not allies in the typical meaning of the word. It's not that Hitler and Stalin are like best buds or anything like that. It's not like they get along well with each other. At this point, they merely tolerate each other. But if you read anything about how and why Adolf Hitler came to power, Hitler is in fundamental disagreement with communism. Hitler is not a communist. He's not a socialist. He, not only that, but he believes that communism, as well as several other factors, again, if you watch the Nazi ideology video, I talk about how part of Hitler's political philosophy is this idea that certain people who were in power, such as communists, such as the Jewish people, that they were responsible for the economic downfall of Germany following the First World War, and Hitler still views these people as a problem. He still views these people as a threat. So Hitler, yes, he made an agreement with Stalin. They signed this non-aggression pact, but they're not inherently allied with each other. So from the get-go, Hitler has at the back of his mind the Soviets as a threat. and the Soviets as a problem to be dealt with. So I oftentimes hear a lot of speculation about Operation Barbarossa, about why Hitler did it. Um, so I should also mention that the reason why Operation Barbarossa is so important is because this is what historians debate about this, but a lot of military historians agree that Hitler carrying out Barbarossa is what's going to lose the war for Hitler. This is a major, major military blunder. 1940, Hitler could have called it quits. As I said before, Hitler could have said, okay, I'm done. UK, let's sign a peace treaty. And that would have been that. There would have been no more World War II. But he decided to attack the Soviet Union, which in the long run was a huge mistake. But so there's this question of, well, why did he do it? As I said before, ideologically speaking, politically speaking, Germany and the Soviet Union were at odds with each other. Hitler is also concerned with the Soviet control of the Baltic region, Soviet oil supplies, Soviet access to the Mediterranean, access to summertime and wintertime ports here in the Mediterranean. Hitler's concerned with the power of the Soviet Union, the growth of the Soviet Union. All of this factors in his decision to carry out Operation Barbarossa, which was the German invasion of the Soviet Union beginning in the summer of 1941. Also tied in with this, so yes, Barbarossa primarily refers to the German invasion of the Soviet Union. It's also at this time, I should note, I'm going to do a separate video on the Holocaust, so I will kind of save my discussion of the Holocaust for that video. But it's also at this time that Hitler starts to ramp up his final solution. He starts to ramp up his plan for the elimination of the Jews. So it's kind of it marks two things: the invasion of the Soviet Union and the implementation. Well, it's already been implemented, so the ramping up of what we call the Holocaust today. So summer 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union. This will be carried out on what's referred to as the Eastern Front. So if you remember in World War I, you had the Western Front and the Eastern Front. This is what Hitler was worried about would happen during World War II. This is why the speedy defeat of France was so important to him. So now we have the opening up of the Eastern Front. And as I said, the failure of Barbarossa will mark a turning point in the war. The general idea is, so Hitler will carry out the same sort of attack that he will on France, what was famous by this time as the lightning warfare of the Germans, the Blitzkrieg of the Germans, a combination of artillery, air force, tank combat to kind of swiftly break through the opponent's defense. He will try the same sort of thing with the Soviets. The major difference is, well, there's a lot of difference. First is the sheer size of the Soviet Union. I mean, Russia is a huge country. As a result, the invasion it won't happen as quickly as it did in France due to geographical size. Yeah, absolutely. It'll kind of move in these three fronts. But the only thing that's really rapid about the attack on the Soviets is the German tank regiments. I should qualify all this by saying I'm not a military historian, and there are way better explanations of this that I'll post here in the chat. But most of the German army in Barbarossa, because of the terrain, because of the size, will be moving by foot. German soldiers will be moving by foot, trying to capture key checkpoints. So the first obstacle and difference between France and the Soviet Union, geographical size. and also the sheer size of the Soviet army. At the beginning of 1941, I want to say the Soviet army had like I can't remember the exact numbers. I'll just post it. I won't embarrass myself by trying to get into the mathematics. But one major difference between the French and the Soviets is that the Soviet army will be able to draw upon this massive reserve, this massive well of people. So yes, the Soviets had a standing army, an army that was ready to fight, but they'll also be able to call in massive amount of reinforcements. Um, that will just kind of bog the Germans down. It won't be a quick invasion. It won't be a quick defeat. Rather, it becomes this slow, drawn out war of attrition. It's really nasty, brutal war between the Germans and Russians, and both sides will see massive, massive casualties. In fact, most of the casualties during the Second World War will happen in this Eastern Front. All right, so two major events of 1941. The first, Operation Barbarossa. The second is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese carry out a surprise attack on the U.S. fleet that is that is based out of Pearl Harbor. Again, the reasons for this are complicated. The the U.S. since the 1930s has had um, a very tense relationship with Japan, specifically over the U.S. colony of the Philippines and U.S. intervention in mainland China. The U.S. and Japan are sitting at odds with one another over control of certain aspects of the Pacific region. And as a result, have kind of butted heads a few times. And so the biggest threat, and of course during the 1920s, 1930s, Japan is starting to expand its empire in the Pacific. And the biggest threat to the Japanese in the Pacific, of course, was the United States. So strategically speaking, this is the sort of the to answer the why. Why did the Japanese attack the United States? Is because the United States was its biggest opponent in the Pacific, and the Japanese believed, perhaps correctly so, that domination in the Pacific hinged upon the defeat of the United States. And the biggest naval base, the biggest U.S. naval base in the Pacific was Pearl Harbor. So, Japanese carry out this attack, which was wildly successful, destroying the fleet at Pearl Harbor and bringing the United States into the Second World War. Here we go. I said it was December 10th. It's actually December 11th. So December 7th, the Japanese attack the United States. December 11th, Germany will declare war on the United States, thereby bringing the United States in as one of the allies, bringing the United States in on the side of the UK and the Soviets. This will be the start to a extensive U.S. and British campaign in the Pacific. If you ever heard of the island hopping campaign, a series of battles and maneuvers and movements that take place, lots of naval battles, lots of battles for control of Pacific islands, and airstrips that will take place throughout 1941. 1942 and 1943 with the U.S. versus the Japanese. This also leads to the major geographical division of the Second World War, the division between oftentimes it's called a theater, right? So you may hear like the European theater of conflict, the European theater of war. That refers to the battles and the battles that were taking place within Europe between the British and the German and the Soviets, and eventually the U.S. and the Pacific Theater. which is the U.S. and the British against the Japanese, and eventually the Soviets against the Japanese. So the European theater and the Pacific theater. All right. Turning points of the war. In the Pacific, the major turning point is going to be the Battle of Guadalcanal. By 1944, the Allies will have captured key locations throughout the Pacific, and so you see a shift in the battle. At the beginning, it's somewhat evenly matched, a couple of Japanese victories, a couple of Allied victories, but after Guadalcanal, Japan is going to be put on the defensive. By 1943, the Soviets will start to counter the German offensive in the European theater. The Battle of Moscow is going to be a major turning point there. You'll start to see the Germans go on the defensive. So, 1943, the German Operation Barbarossa has kind of petered out. The German push into the Soviet Union has kind of petered out. And now the Soviets are pushing back, retaking the land that was taken from them, moving back into Europe. By 1944, the United States is slowly pushing Japan out of the Pacific theater, moving closer and closer to mainland Japan. Also in 1944, there will be a very large, probably the largest, I think the largest amphibious assault in history. 1944, Europe, in the European theater, the UK, along with its Commonwealth armies, such as the Canadian, Australian, Indian forces, will, with the Americans, invade mainland France, invade mainland Europe to take France back from Nazi Germany on the D-Day campaign, Operation Overlord. Again, this is going to put the Germans on their heels. It's going to put the Germans on the defensive. And at least in the European theater, you're having the Germans pushed, what Hitler feared, you're having the Germans pushed on both sides. So, actually, let me bring up my map so I'm not just talking with my hands. Okay, so you have the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. This was something that Stalin said this has to happen, all right? Because for about a year, Stalin is fighting Nazi Germany alone. In terms of boots on the ground, in terms of who's suffering the most casualties, who's doing the most fighting, a lot of it, like I said, the most casualties is lost in the Eastern Theater of Combat in Europe. So Stalin is begging the United Kingdom and France to launch some sort of attack on Germany's other side, to divert troops from the Eastern Front over to the Western Front. This happens with D-Day. So Germany is going to be being pushed, being sandwiched between the British and the Americans in Nazi-occupied France, and the Soviets on this side. Again, the Soviets slowly reclaiming their land, making their way back into Europe. All right. So, end of the war. Let's talk about the end of the war in Europe first. Like I said, the Allies are pushing into Germany from both fronts and from the south. There's also going to be an Allied invasion of Italy on the 28th of April, 1945, I'm sorry, April 1945. So the Allies are going to invade Italy, but in addition to the Allied invasion of Italy, there's going to be Italian partisans who are going to initiate revolts and protest throughout Italian cities. All of this is going to completely destabilize Italy. On April 28th, Mussolini, the leader of Italy, the leader of the Axis Italy during World War II, will be executed. Italy will basically collapse at this point and be divided between Allied-controlled Italy and Nazi-controlled Italy. German forces will move in to kind of protect their southern border. The battle for Berlin. So by this time, the Allied forces had moved into mainland Germany. The Battle of Berlin will take place April through May 1945. Of course, Hitler in his bunker, along with some chiefs of staff, Hitler will commit suicide in April 1945, leading to the surrender of Germany and the end of the war in the European theater. Shortly thereafter, 1945, the Japanese will suffer a string of defeats, including a defeat in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. These are all very decisive victories for the Allied forces. I'll also probably do a separate video on the Manhattan Project. This is a very important aspect of the Second World War. But also in 1945, the U.S. will drop the atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to massive Japanese casualties. And August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito will formally surrender to the Allied forces. And that will mark the end of the Second World War. So we'll stop the video there. There's some follow-up. The Second World War has a tremendous impact on worldwide culture, politics, art, literature. It kind of its effect, its impact, its ripple effect can be felt throughout all of culture. So definitely a lot to follow up here. I'm just kind of tracking in terms of the military progress, what happens. But we'll stop the video there. As always, if you have any questions, let me know, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. See you later, folks.